Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got a really interesting guest for you tonight who's written a fascinating column about the parallels between Trump's negotiations in Ukraine or with Ukraine right now in regards to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Afghanistan. Shoaib Rahim is my guest tonight. He is the former mayor of Kabul. He obviously is extremely knowledgeable what's going on in Afghanistan. He is currently a professor of the American University of Afghanistan, albeit teaching remotely. He works in Toronto now. And he's written this column, which is Donald Trump's Playbook on Ukraine is the same one he used to withdraw from Afghanistan. It's a fascinating column. It's a fascinating argument. And it's my pleasure to welcome Shoaib Rahim to my show. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much for having me, Brian. Pleasure to be here.
So tell me, why is his negotiation in regards to Zelensky, Ukraine, and Russia the same as the withdrawal from Afghanistan? What are the parallels?
Well, there are many parallels. In the article, Ed and I, Edward Schatz, we co-authored this piece and wanted to draw attention to the methodology that Trump is using in Ukraine. Unfortunately, we're seeing it play out in a much more aggressive manner. In Afghanistan, during Trump's first presidency, he became very quickly impatient with the war. He wanted quick results. He's a man of quick results and getting the deal done quickly, and he keeps on using that word. As he did a couple of days ago in the Oval Office with Zelensky. We want peace quickly. He kept on reiterating, and so the decision he made was to bypass partners of 20 years, which was the government of Afghanistan, a non-NATO major ally, a signatory of many security agreements, and directly negotiate with the Taliban. And those negotiations started in secret. And then once they were revealed, created a lot of chaos. And so when there was resistance by the government of the time, by the people of Afghanistan, and at that point in time, Ashraf Ghani was the president, Trump's response was simply to pressure him and force him into compliance, very similar to what is happening with his approach towards Zelensky. Zelensky, the darling of the world and the United States, after standing up to Russian aggression, was almost overnight turned into this character who apparently started the war and is responsible for what is happening. And so many like to argue, or many like to kind of brush aside Trump's rhetoric as, oh, this is just the art of his art of his way of deal making.
Oh, he's been making deals for 30, 40, 50 years. He's been in real estate. He's a great negotiator. If the only person that could ever bring about a negotiation is Donald J. Trump. That's what we hear constantly.
Well, I mean, let's have a conversation about that. Just because he has been making deals all his life doesn't mean that they are good deals. Let's have a look at the quality of those deals. His strategy when it comes to international conflicts is simply to walk away. He is walking away from the war in Ukraine. He walked away from Afghanistan. Whether he was right or not is a separate conversation. But it's very easy to make deals when you give everything away for free to the other side. That doesn't require much skill. I'm not able to hear you, Brian.
I used to work for a Canadian billionaire by the name of Jimmy Pattison, who used to say, Brian, you can always buy a company if you don't care how much you pay. In other words, you could, as you say, you could always get a deal done if you just give in.
Well, unfortunately, that's exactly what's happening. And when we saw the way in which he approached Moscow to start off the peace talks in Ukraine, Russia essentially required a few guarantees. The Russian position has been very clear in this war. We will not give up any territory that we've acquired. That's one. Number two is we will not accept Ukrainian membership to NATO, which is almost a non-issue now. I don't think anybody's pushing for that anymore. And number three, we will not accept any troops on the ground under the guise of peacekeepers or any such umbrella. And the Trump negotiation team in Saudi Arabia a couple of weeks ago, Trump hasn't accepted this publicly, but all these points have already been accepted. The only carrot that was dangling in front of the White House was this minerals deal. And the minerals deal is now out the window after the exchange, the very heated exchange that happened in the Oval Office. And even during the conversation regarding the minerals deal, no issue of security guarantees were being proposed. So essentially, Zelensky was arguing, if we were to put ourselves in his shoes, Zelensky was arguing, look, we've been fighting this war, not just for our own territorial integrity, but to protect Europe and Western democracies from Russian aggression. And so that's how the camps go. And now you're walking away. You're asking us to give you this very lucrative minerals deal in exchange for what exactly? You need to give us some assurance that you will continue. And he was not willing to do that. And so when he asked the question, unfortunately, that setup was not the best diplomatic setup. That exchange did not need to happen, not for the Ukrainian people, not for the American people. I think a lot of calculations will change now that a head of state was treated that way in the Oval Office by the President of the United States. But we saw that there was no intention to provide security guarantees. So in the end, even that minerals deal wasn't meant to really change the decision to walk away from Ukraine. And Europe, mind you, is a non-player in this. Zelensky is in London, was in London yesterday. He got some assurances. The Europeans are holding an emergency summit. But Europe cannot continue this war without the Americans. And because Donald Trump knows this, he is not giving anybody a seat at the table. Very similar to how he unilaterally negotiated with the Taliban. And I remember the U.S. Special Envoy to Afghanistan at that point, Zalmay Khalilzad, he's an Afghan American. He used to fly to Brussels and meet with European special envoys to debrief them on what was going on in Doha, only after the talks were leaked. And the Europeans were very frustrated. They kept on coming to us. I was involved in the peace process from the government side at that point. They were collecting information from us, essentially. So what's going on? And so we are now facing a very harsh reality of European irrelevance and the dependency of the world on the US, just financially, militarily, is very obvious. But the way Donald Trump is exploiting that is somewhat unprecedented. So it's a bit of a shocker. But in this article, we try to argue that, look, there is some order to this. It's not complete chaos. He knows what he's doing. We might not agree with what he's doing, but he has a playbook.
So, the first argument you've made is that he went into direct conversations and cut out the existing people, and that's clear to the case. The second one is that he effectively gave the other party almost everything they wanted. Is that true? Did Trump give the Taliban almost everything they wanted?
Not almost, entirely everything they wanted. The Taliban wanted a commitment to withdraw troops from Afghanistan without any conditions, without any ambiguous terms. And Trump agreed to that. They gave a 14-month withdrawal timeline. That's number one. Number two was that you will engage us and you will support us in any future government that is formed. And that commitment was also given. Now, the text of the Doha deal, the text of the Doha agreement, which was signed while Pompeo was Secretary of State, that text required, in exchange for this withdrawal, that the Taliban not fire on American soldiers on their way out. That was the big one. And very loosely worded language that said you will not allow Afghanistan soil to be used by terrorist organizations to attack America and its allies, which was the reason why this whole war started back in 2001 due to the Twin Tower attacks. And so the language in the deal was such that the Taliban were not required to cut off ties. The Taliban were not required to remove Al-Qaeda or other terrorist organizations, capture them, hand them over. They were simply required to provide assurances that Al-Qaeda and terrorist groups will not threaten US and their allies from Afghanistan. How that is done was not committed to. And then finally, what they asked from the Taliban was, oh, why don't you also start negotiations with the government, who has been our 20-year-long partner in this fight, and just have a conversation with them. No commitment to actually reach a result, no commitment to have a ceasefire or end the war before the troops, U.S. troops leave. So essentially, on one side, the Taliban got the U.S. and NATO had to leave. Without the Americans, NATO would not survive. And on the other side, the Taliban simply committed to paying lip service. They started the conversation with the government delegation, but it very quickly went into deadlock. They housed the number one Al-Qaeda leader, Zawahiri, in Kabul in 2002. And so there had to be a drone attack, a drone strike by the US in the heart of Kabul under the Taliban. And so they said, look, you agreed with the Doha deal. And the Taliban were like, we agreed that Afghanistan will not be used against America and its allies. So essentially, and by the way, just 2 days ago, the Taliban also declared that we no longer accept the Doha deal. It's no longer effective. So that great Trump negotiation deal he made was discarded just a couple of days ago by the Taliban. So that is the only reference point. That is the only other foreign deal that Trump has made, essentially. So if we're going to compare what's going to happen in Ukraine, that's the closest we can get. So his deals give away everything, just to conclude. His deals don't really guarantee much for the American people. And his deals tend to be discarded very quickly. So if I were Zelensky or Ukraine, I would be very, very worried.
Your argument is that Trump, based on his historical experience negotiating the deal with the Taliban for Afghanistan, let me understand this explicitly, give away everything, don't make any guarantees, and allow those agreements to be ripped up and not honored later on.
Well, these are not issues that he cares about. So yes, that is unfortunately the playbook. And we're seeing it play out in Ukraine. There are no guarantees. And if we watch the 45-minute exchange in the Oval Office that took place, we could see all those backdoor negotiations come to light. He told Zelensky that, your soldiers are brave, they're fighting, but you can't continue without our weapons. So essentially, he's saying you have no choice. You need to accept whatever we agree with Moscow and Vladimir Putin. And so that's difficult. That's difficult for Ukrainians. That's difficult for the Europeans to accept. The hard truth is, and this was also the case in Afghanistan, that there is so much dependency on American military might that with a president in the White House that simply wants to walk away, there's not much you can do. And this depend. So Europe is waking up to this, maybe a little too late, unfortunately for the Ukrainians. But that is the world we live in, where essentially the terms are dictated by the White House, and everybody else has to choose to play along or fend for themselves. And what type of new world order this will trigger in the coming years, that will be interesting to follow.
This is going to be an interesting conversation today, talking about Donald Trump, Zelensky, the negotiations with Russia and Ukraine, and making the comparisons to Trump's effective abdication of everything in Afghanistan. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Shoaib Rahim. He has written a really fascinating article about Donald Trump's playbook on Ukraine is the same one he used to withdraw from Afghanistan. And effectively what he's been arguing is that playbook was give up and just give everything the other side wants. Fascinating. Shoaib Rahim served as the chief financial officer and acting mayor of Kabul from 2016 to 2019, and he's lectured at the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He's currently a professor at the American University of Afghanistan, doing those studies remotely, and he also works now in downtown Toronto. One of the things that I was most shocked with in the exchange on Friday in the Oval Office was Donald Trump saying, "You don't have any cards," and Zelensky saying, "I'm not playing cards." How did you take that?
That was a very difficult exchange. And that was difficult to watch because despite the method of delivery, and I think there's almost unanimous agreement that Donald Trump and his vice president, J.D. Vance, were essentially bullying Zelensky. The tone, the exchange was not very pleasant. Despite the tone and the style of conversation, Trump was calling out Zelensky and pointing out to the fact that Ukraine has no choice but to simply comply with what I'm saying. And Zelensky's response was also, in my eyes, and in the eyes of people in my generation who experienced the U.S. exit from Afghanistan, his response was very tragic. And his response that I'm not playing cards means almost implicitly accepts what Donald Trump is saying. But he's also saying you're asking us to capitulate and you're asking us to pay a price that is essentially too high. And that is something that we simply cannot do. And so that deadlock created a very heated exchange, which happens behind closed doors anyway. Now, in Afghanistan's case, there were very, very heated exchanges. Donald Trump himself was not involved, but his Secretary of State and his special envoy were with the president of Afghanistan at that point in time. Very, very heated exchanges, which we were privy to, but the general public was not. And so the Oval Office back and forth makes it very difficult for future conflicts and future partnerships and alliances to be based on meaningful, lasting relationships. Because once your starting point in any relationship is you can walk away anytime you want and leave me out to dry, that essentially removes a lot of potential partnerships and alliances. And whether or not Donald Trump thinks that is important, which he doesn't think it is. He doesn't really care. He accuses people of being quote unquote globalists. His America First ideological platform looks down on anybody who wants to continue arguing for American credibility in the world. In Donald Trump's eyes, it's all transactional. The US is the biggest economy in the world, it's the biggest military in the world. You have to deal with us. You don't really have a choice. You don't have to like it. It is what it is. So where does that leave NATO? Where does that leave Canada? Where does that leave? So smaller countries are not even in his radar, essentially. He doesn't even want to waste time speaking
He's going to militarily take over Greenland, and he's going to use economic coercion to take over Canada, make it the 51st state. Let me ask you, was there another option in Afghanistan? And is the United States and the world in a better place given that he effectively ended the war? And to put it in perspective, and you probably know all these numbers, but my sense is that Canada, the United States, other NATO countries spent a lot of money and lost a lot of people fighting in Afghanistan. To what end? If we didn't get anything out of the ultimate negotiation, and we've left Afghanistan, the Taliban has taken over, was there any benefit to that loss of life? Is the world a better place today? Is the United States a better place today? Is it safer today, given the deal that Trump negotiated for Afghanistan?
It's a very good question. The first part of your question, was there an alternative? Absolutely. The US Congress had a bipartisan committee to review all the options and put forth the various options for the US, which ranged from full withdrawal to leaving a residual force, less than 5,000, even less than 3,000, or simply walking away without a deal with the Taliban. And none of those options, which were all internal US congressionally mandated review proposed to the White House, none of them were accepted by Biden. And Biden said, I will continue committing to the Doha deal, which was negotiated and signed under Trump. And so the alternative would have been if US and NATO withdrew from Afghanistan and the government of the time would continue. There was no need to bring the Taliban to power. If you're arguing that the world is a better place with the Taliban in power, then we're going to need to have another conversation. Is Afghanistan better off with the Taliban in power? The 40 million population, 20 million women and girls, the nightmare scenario the country is going through. The security threats, Al Qaeda and all the other terrorist groups, which the NATO and Afghanistan army were jointly fighting. All of them are recruiting, training, and planning inside Afghanistan. Now, it has not resulted in another 9/11, thankfully, yet, but that threat is still going on. And that is unfortunately a scenario that we are potentially looking at. American credibility was very strongly damaged and hurt the way the exit happened and the way that deal was struck. Many argue that, and even Trump himself said this, he blamed it on Biden. He forgot that he was the one who struck the deal, that Moscow was emboldened to invade Ukraine because of how Afghanistan turned out. Because in Moscow's calculation, at the end of the day, the Western alliance will not stay till the end, and they will leave. And so all these were all consequences of the Doha deal in Afghanistan and the way that deal was struck and the way that deal was executed. Now, take that, the lessons learned from Afghanistan, apply it to Ukraine. What the Ukrainians are arguing is that we can't trust Putin because we did sign agreements with him, and we did have all these processes that Trump is asking us to do back in 2014 after the invasion and usurpation of Crimea. But he simply went back on his word. So what's to stop him from doing it again and again until we lose all of
And Trump
Ukraine?
says, well, he's never broken a deal with me. Trust me. He trusts me. I trust him. You know, Canada's had its own experience with Trump effectively calling a deal the worst deal ever negotiated, even though it was his deal that he negotiated it, the free trade agreement between Canada, US, and Mexico, and then breaking it. And the current tariffs all being effectively illegal relative to that deal that he negotiated. So what you're, I think, saying is that we got nothing out of, what was it, 20 years of involvement in Afghanistan? And how many people, how many Canadians were lost in Afghanistan? And Trump?
This was the largest deployment of Canadian military since World War II.
And we got nothing for it, nothing out of it. Because of Trump.
Unfortunately, the way the deal was struck, because things collapsed, it's very difficult to look for silver linings and all the progress that was made across 20 years because of the way it ended.
Now, you're not a military expert, but let me ask you, I've had a conversation with people that said there were other options. And the two that I've been given were the surge in Iraq. And I guess the story was that the U.S. was not winning the Iraqi war, and that I think it was General Petraeus at the time said the only solution is either give up or a massive incremental investment that was described as the surge, and that was what could win the war. And the U.S. invested that extra money and resources and personnel, and ultimately won the war in Iraq. I'd love to know what your point of view is. Are we better off today than it would have been if we had just left the way we left in Afghanistan? And then the other example that I was given, which may be a more difficult one, but was that in 1943, Churchill was encouraging an invasion into France. FDR said, we're not ready, and stretched it out a full another year. And built up resources dramatically greater, such that there would be effectively a surge and an ultimate success. Which meant that extra year cost a lot of lives, cost a lot of bombing in London, cost a lot of lives in the Eastern Front in Russia. So it was that extra year cost a lot, but the surge, or the equivalent of that surge, meant that there was ultimate success on D-Day. So was there another alternative in Afghanistan? Would either of those analogies work? And then obviously I'm going to ask you what the analogy would.
So in Afghanistan, a surge did take place under President Obama in 2009. And then the plan was that after the surge, that was exactly the strategy applied. After the surge and a military defeat of the Taliban, then the withdrawal would happen. And in 2014, the US NATO troop levels went down from 120,000 troops on the ground to less than 20,000, 15,000 troops in a span of 1 year. And then a security agreement was signed with the government of the time. The problem was that the US NATO presence in any conflict, this is unfortunately generally the case, but specifically in Afghanistan, it dictated terms the way it saw fit. It did not take into account the local domestic drivers of conflict. Now, there were opportunities where the Taliban were on board for a peace deal. There were opportunities where there could be political reconciliation and the war would end much sooner. The US was not interested, was not having it. And then all of a sudden, when the White House decided that now it's time for peace, the domestic actors and stakeholders were not ready because they would lose advantage. And so they were like, give us time to get ready. They were like, no, it's too late. We're leaving. You have to sign the peace deal. And so I can't speak to the World War II example, but I think the observation here is that the people aren't talking to each other. That's one. Secondly, it's my way or the highway. If it's a my way or the highway approach, then you're not going to get success. You're not going to get a win. In this case, there was an opportunity. In the case of Ukraine, there was an opportunity to end the war and reach a deal very early on. But the Europeans and Americans were very hell bent on essentially defeating the Russians and crushing them and bleeding them out. And so the strategy changed. And now, 3 years later, Ukrainians are worse off for it. But these issues can be argued either way. I think what we are trying to understand is the inner workings of Donald Trump's strategy, which I think the entire world is trying to figure out.
On numerous different issues. But come back, if I could, to the surge. Is there another alternative? Is there a surge alternative? Is there something that the United States could do to improve the situation if it so desired?
Well, I think the first message you have to send when it comes to issues like this is that until certain conditions are met, we will not cut and run. Unfortunately, that is a line that Donald Trump has already crossed. He has already committed ending funding and ending supporting Ukraine in their war against Russia. That's the biggest leverage that the Ukrainians have. That's the biggest leverage that Europe has, and that the American side has had. We're going to continue this war, and you're going to ultimately pay the price for it unless you reach a meaningful, sustainable deal. When you've given away your biggest leverage, they're just going to wait it out. That was exactly what happened with the Taliban when they committed to withdrawing. We're leaving and ending this war either way. All the Taliban had to do was wait it out. And they took over completely. And so I think one alternative to what Trump is doing is to, A, not commit to ending support, funding, or sending in weapons to fight. B, having a process which includes the Ukrainians. That is the only way you can reach any deal that is sustainable. If you don't involve the party which is actually doing the fighting, then enforcing anything would be different. It's a capitulation, and they're going to have to raise the white flag and accept whatever the Russians tell them.
Fascinating issue. And it would appear to me that, frankly, politically, Trump has blamed Biden for the withdrawal from Afghanistan, even though what you're saying is he was the one that was negotiated the deal and was responsible for the deal.
Trump was responsible for the deal. It was signed under his presidency. Biden had the option to review, modify, or accept. And he chose to accept it wholeheartedly. And he went behind the podium and committed to a full withdrawal without any conditions on September 11th of 2021. And so that's when all the pieces started crumbling. And people realized that, hey, this has happened. This is happening, and the Americans are leaving. We're not ready to continue this war independently. And so people started hedging. And so Biden, of course, takes his fair share of the blame, the way he executed the withdrawal. Biden and his incompetence when it came to Afghanistan is not a fact that you can hide. But I think to completely blame this on Biden is very simplistic. The entire setup and the entire framework for this arrangement was negotiated and agreed upon during Donald Trump's time.
We're chatting tonight about whether there is a playbook that Donald Trump has in regards to his negotiation of peace deals, and that everything that he's doing in regards to Ukraine has parallels in his negotiation with the Taliban for his walking away from Afghanistan. Fascinating argument, interesting discussion. We're going to be back in 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.
No problem.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Our guest tonight is Shoaib Rahim. He is the former chief financial officer and acting mayor of Kabul, Afghanistan, from 2016 to 2019. This guy was right there in the front lines. He has since then lectured at the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He lives and works in downtown Toronto, and he is a professor with the American University in Afghanistan. And he's written a fascinating article that Donald Trump's playbook on Ukraine is the same one he used to withdraw from Afghanistan. And we've talked through a couple of the issues, sir, that you've identified in the article about how he's cut out other people and just entered into direct conversations, negotiations with the Taliban, with Putin, how he's sort of given up a lot of the prior given in to a lot of the demands from either the Taliban and or Russia. And then one of the other things that you say, which is kind of interesting, is that you say that he sort of has this desire to just cut costs no matter what. And you actually go to Elon Musk and what's happening with Doge and sort of not caring about people and just sort of cutting. So clearly, one of the things that Donald Trump wants to do is cut the commitment of U.S. dollars being spent in Ukraine. And what you're arguing, I guess, is that he doesn't care about the lives of Ukrainians. He just cares about the dollars that the U.S. is committed, and he wants to reduce that. And then the last argument that you make is that he's actually questioned Europe's motivations for supporting Ukraine. Explain that to me if you could. What do you think he's questioning here?
So I think what we're trying to argue in this piece, Ed Schatz and I, is that it's very difficult to argue or convince Donald Trump and his administration to look beyond any responsibility or obligation that he feels he is compelled to deliver. Now, in any democratic order, an elected head of state is given a mandate by the population. His mandate by his movement, the MAGA movement, and the voter turnout in elections was to cut costs, and there was this whole ideological undertone to all of it. But beyond the borders, internationally, I think the way that has manifested is that he is out to essentially undo a lot of the frameworks and agreements that the United States was committed to for decades. And he is just looking at it as wasteful spending. A lot of it is wasteful spending. I'm not here to defend any of the USAID programs. I'm not here to defend any graph that's there. That's not my place. And that's not what the article is pointing to. What we are pointing to is trying to understand his psychological drive. And he simply does not care about the consequences as long as the dollars and cents are making sense and can be justified. Now, whether the American people would agree with him in the primaries or down the line, or if once polls are coming out, is a different story. But the way he is implementing his foreign policy when it comes to Europe is he's essentially arguing that the Europeans are burdening us. We feel, based on what Trump says, we feel that this relationship is costing America, and Europe is sitting comfortably and taking advantage of the protection that America is granting it. And he wants to change that equilibrium. And so he's pushing Europe to spend more militarily. And there is an argument to be made here. I'm not saying this is a wrong argument, but it's the way that you implement and enforce a strategy. It's a way that you talk to friends, and there's a way to do it, and there's a way not to do it. I think another very interesting data point is the American vote in the United Nations General Assembly in line with Russia and China against Europe on language when it came to the war in Ukraine. And so that was unprecedented. And so if Donald Trump is willing to walk away from NATO and walk away from all the arrangements and agreements that has kept the Western order the way it is, then we have bigger conversations.
So, but what about his argument? And you heard this, even more in a more detailed manner by his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, that you can't enter negotiations with someone if you're calling them a war criminal, if you're insulting them constantly. And so effectively, I think what Marco Rubio was saying is that you can't have that UN declaration saying that the war was started by Russia. You can't call him a war criminal. You can't have that, what I think is very accurate, but that very accurate negative comments if you actually want to sit down with the guy and have a conversation. Is there any?
Well, actually, negotiations require clarity of position. If you start your negotiations by caving in and pampering to the other person, then you're already indicating that you're willing to compromise far more than the other side. Starting off with tough language, and Trump in absolutely no way is tough in these negotiations. He keeps on saying he's tough in these negotiations. How is he tough? He's giving Moscow everything they want. He is bullying the little guy. How is that tough? Right. So language that pushes Moscow to come up with meaningful guarantees is removed. Um, Look,
I think part of the problem
not.
is that Trump doesn't see any downside other than the benefit of the savings of money, and Zelensky tried to get that in, and I can't remember exactly the words that he used, but it was something like you're going to be in a worse position if Ukraine loses effectively, and I guess that's the thing I want to turn to next. And again, you're the expert on Afghanistan, so you may not know in detail, but I wonder if this is Munich all over again. And we're going to take a break, and I want to come back and ask you about what could happen if the U.S. walks away from Ukraine, because I think that's the real risk. That's the real issue here. And I don't think that Donald Trump, I don't think the United States, I don't think enough people think about what could happen. Stay with us, everyone. Back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm really enjoying, and it's not in a good way because it's really an intellectual conversation and a very frank conversation, because I think the outcome of this conversation analysis that Shoaib Rahim has put together is very negative for our current situation and for the world, because what he's effectively saying is Donald Trump is a terrible negotiator, and that what you could see in his negotiation of the deal with the Taliban for Afghanistan, of a complete appeasement, complete capitulation of everything that Canada and the United States and NATO worked for, spent money for, lost people for in Afghanistan, was given up for no benefit. And the analogy of that would be the same thing in Ukraine. If Shoaib is correct that Trump is going to do the same thing, just give in, and frankly, it sounds like you're right. I want to try another analogy, if I could, for a second, and that is Chamberlain in 1938 and the Munich conference, where clearly the whole world didn't want another world war, given what had just happened, 15 years earlier with World War I and the Great Depression, and Hitler was demanding Czechoslovakia, and I think today people would think that Chamberlain gave in and gave in everything that Germany wanted, that Hitler wanted at the time, and for a year. Almost, not quite, 11 months, I think it was. Chamberlain looked right, and that and the world was supportive. And frankly, there were rallies in the U.S. that were supportive of Hitler and what he was doing. And so a lot of the comparables to today are there. Isolationism, nationalism, America first, not supporting what was going on. With people that were concerned about the rise of Hitler and the growth of the German army at the time, et cetera, et cetera. And there was only one person that within a couple of days after that negotiation in the Munich conference stood up and made a point, and that was Winston Churchill, who said, "You will come to regret this," effectively, as one of the worst acts of diplomacy in the history of the world. Regrettably, 11 months later, Churchill was proven right, Chamberlain was proven wrong. And what Chamberlain thought is that by giving Hitler Czechoslovakia, he would stop Hitler from advancing. The concerns that many in the Baltic states have today, in Poland, in Eastern Europe, is that if you allow Putin to take 20% of Ukraine, he will then continue to take the balance of Ukraine, and he'll potentially move on some other countries. And so I guess the concern that I have, and I think Zelensky was suggesting in his conversation, was you give up on Ukraine, you're going to be in a worse position, US. But Trump doesn't believe that. He believes that Putin is going to be happy with 20% of Ukraine. What do you think? Is there an analogy there? Should the world be worried? Should we see this as another Munich? Appease someone, and then a year from now we'll regret it.
So I think in that exchange, Donald Trump said to Zelensky that you are playing with World War III. And I think that speaks to his defense. He's saying that I'm doing this to avoid superpowers going into direct conflict with each other. That's his defense. And that is a very strong defense, mind you. That is a very strong argument. But I think based on simple history and the consensus that exists outside of Donald Trump's circle, appeasing to Russia or to any superpower and giving in Ukraine might lead to potential conflict between superpowers because it emboldens others. Trump keeps on saying Putin would never do it when I'm around. Well, the fact of the matter is, even if that is true, you will not always be around. So the problem now that we have, the impact of a withdrawal from Ukraine will be felt not only in Europe. That's one. Europe is a direct impact. But then we can go halfway across the world and look at Taiwan. Taiwan is the other hotspot, which will be under focus because it is the main point of contention between China and the United States. And China will be emboldened to potentially make a move. China is much smarter in a much more different position than Moscow. So that's a completely different context. But we have to understand that I think the balance that existed in the world after World War II is being the boat is being rocked essentially. He's rocking the boat to an extent where we're not going to be sure if the boat's going to capsize or what's going to happen. And that's what's getting people worried. And he's being very careless and moving too fast. It's just too complicated an issue, these global relations. One last thing I will say on Donald Trump's thinking is that he argued a few weeks ago that he will sit with Putin and Xi Jinping to reduce their investment in military investments overall. Why are we spending so much money on war? We need to be spending. And Beijing and Moscow were jubilated. They were like, "This is brilliant. This is great." The biggest military in the world is telling us that he and us will now spend far less in our military than before. That's going to level the playing field. Now, whether that leveling the playing field will result in greener pastures, a rosier world where it's all about trade and commerce and no one uses force to project power, I think is very simplistic. I think the harsh reality is that you need to be able to balance out your military might and ability to project power. And Trump is undermining that ability, despite the fact that he's constantly saying we're the strongest military in the world. But you're not behaving or acting like the strongest military in the world. You're simply caving in and walking away. And so it's going to become very difficult to rely on American assurances moving forward. And that creates a lot of space for China and for Russia, and on a regional level for a lot of actors who are considered not just hostile, but are considered not considered allies to American and Western causes in general. So we're going to have a new world order in our hands if this continues.
A new world order on our hands if this continues. Profound comments. My final comment would be, I think Donald Trump has been arguing for a while that he believes you get peace through strength. And I think what you've proven in your article and what this conversation and lots of others going around the world right now are suggesting is that that's not actually Donald Trump's negotiating style and or what he actually believes. He believes you get peace through appeasement. He believes you get peace from abdication of responsibility. As you said, he gets peace from walking away. And that's a shame. That's not right. And I think that, as you say, it's going to lead to a new world order. And I'm scared, very scared. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 a.m. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. You can get all my podcasts and videos after the fact on my website, briancrombie.com, on social media, on YouTube, and on several different podcast servers. Thanks. I really appreciate it. This was a fascinating conversation and an excellent column. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.